we're developing the Tau research projects, we've been looking for people who sit at the sort of boundary of academic research and the practice of journalism. And Claire kind of sits exactly there with a PhD in communications, but also working in newsrooms on the implementation of verification tools and social media inside newsrooms. So she was kind of the perfect person to lead this project. And Sam has also an extensive career inside newsrooms in broadcast journalism. And they've spent countless hours watching video about user-generated video that were aired on broadcast networks, and interviewing news executives. Let me just. Anyways, so with that said, I will pass it on to them. The report is now live on our website as well, and they are going to walk us through their project. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Taylor. And thank you for sticking it out for Friday afternoon. The hardcore data journalists have left the room. What they don't know is we're going to do a dance routine, so it's their loss. So firstly, we'd like to say thank you very much to the Tau Centre for enabling us to do this research and to bring us over. This research actually was done from my living room in Spain and Sam's living room in Istanbul and our research assistant that was based in England. So it's actually just nice for us to be in the same room. So there was a feat of collaboration in terms of research that we learned a lot from, as well as user-generated content. So just very quickly about the background, the reason that we wanted to do this research is that back in 2008, I wrote a report about user-generated content and the BBC. In that report, believe it or not, there was only one mention of a social network, and that was Facebook. Fast forward to 2014, we now take for granted that user-generated content is being shared on social media, and news organizations are turning to those social networks during breaking news events. But I spent a year working with Storyful, and we spent all day looking at user-generated content, but we didn't know how much of this stuff was being used by newsrooms. And the only way to find out was just to watch a hell of a lot of news, which is what we did. So just over to Sam.
Yeah, and one person working with us on this report was Pete Brown. He was our research assistant. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it across the Atlantic to join us. He's actually watching this stream live from his parents' ironing room. It's the only room in his house in rural England that actually has access to the internet. So, hello, Pete.
So in terms of user-generated content, I think everybody in the room knows it's one of the worst phrases around, and really the Tau Centre should have given us a lot of money to sit in a dark room coming up with a better term. We failed miserably. So if anybody has a better phrase than user-generated content, please share it with the news industry. It encompasses a lot, but for the purposes of this research, we really wanted to focus on photographs and videos captured by people unrelated to the newsroom who would not describe themselves as professional journalists. It just trips off the tongue. We are aware that we missed quite a lot of really interesting participatory journalism elements, but we couldn't do everything. But we wanted to be very clear about how we define UGC for the purposes of this report.
And during the research, Claire and I spent a lot of time traveling around different newsrooms, talking to different people. In fact, in the 9 months Claire and I met up, we've never consecutively met in the same country, never mind the same city. And throughout the talking to all these people, one particular theme came out. And they very much talked about, in different newsrooms across the world, about social media, user-generated content being the Wild West. There are no rules, people don't really know what to do, they're all feeling their way, they're taking a lot of liberties with regulations, rules, normal newsroom practices. And in fact, during also our conversations, many newsrooms, because of that, really wanted to know what other newsrooms were doing. And they would say, oh, do you know what so-and-so's doing? Could you tell us what so-and-so's doing? So there are really no standards across the industry. And the other thing that came out very much in our early discussions was the difference in the way that senior managers in newsrooms talked about UGC, and if you like, the shop floor talked about UGC. The senior managers haven't sat in newsrooms for a long time. This has come up very much in the last 5 years or so. The new senior managers don't use this stuff. It is a new challenge. And the change has been very much a push-up from the shop floor. And because of that kind of bad understanding of senior news managers of UGC and how to use it and what the rules are around it, we actually had to make the decision not to quote anybody in the research, because some of the quotes were very surprising. And we didn't really want him to get into hot water. That was despite the fact that everybody except 2 of all the people we interviewed actually gave us permission to use their names, their organization in the research.
So the research had two phases, and the first phase of the report was actually published last month, and that was the quantitative element, and we're going to go over some of those main findings. And we use that as the foundation to say how much UGC is being used and when is it being used. But from that, it became clear that there are 6 main issues that newsrooms are struggling with. And you can see at the top, we run through these series of slides, those 6 different issues. And the way that the report is written means that if you don't have time to read 37,000 words, you can, if you want to, pick out a certain chapter that might be more relevant to you. But you can see there it's around verification, it's around crediting, it's about labeling, it's around ethics. So no big surprises necessarily about the issues, but how people talked about these issues actually were really surprising. So first of all, we want to talk about the kind of how, when, and why that these 6 issues are built upon.
So the first part, we coded 8 news channels over 3 weeks and got a huge amount of content. We chose those channels because we knew that evening bulletins would have very little UGC in, so we felt we would get a bigger data set if we chose rolling channels. We also wanted to steer away from the usual research which talks about a kind of US-UK axis of news. And we chose news channels which had an international scope, whose audience, the audience of which the channel was aiming at was an international audience. Now, we were a little bit naive in our research planning. What we found out was that most news channels don't actually record their output. I very naively thought, oh, we'll just go and ask them for 3 weeks of output and they'll give it to us. They didn't. So what we had to do was find a way to record these channels. Now, I managed to record 6 channels at home on the internet through internet streaming, which involved getting up at midnight, getting up at 4 in the morning, coming home early in the afternoon. It was a bit like having a 4-month-old baby again. And thankfully, we had some very kind help. The NHK, the Japanese public broadcaster, asked one member of staff to record all their content, especially for us, for 3 weeks, and then sent us a big pile of Blu-ray discs to do the coding from. And my stepfather, John, who's sitting in the middle here, hey, John, very kindly recorded CNN International for us. So thank you for all that assistance from everyone who gave it to us. On the website, we got so much content that we actually decided we could only code 5 days. You'll see that in a second. The 5 days were chosen randomly by Pete's 3-year-old niece. So also thank you to Pete's 3-year-old niece for choosing those 3 days. And then we had the job of coding it. As you can see here, we got 2,115 items were used on the TV of UGC over 21 days, and 758 online over the 5 days we chose. That gave a daily average online of 152 items, and a daily average on television of 100 items. So we had 30% more online than we did have on television. This can obviously be put down to the fact that there's a lot more space online. News organizations are happy to have breaking news blogs, special thematic events, pages for special events, and so on and so forth.
So it was important actually to look at the different channels because they're not using it uniformly. So if you look at that big pink bubble on the top right-hand corner, Al Jazeera Arabic, they love their UGC. This isn't surprising because of their editorial agenda, but it really was astounding how much user-generated content they used every day. But actually, if you look at NHK or Tell Us Sir, it was very, very rare. But generally, we're looking at between kind of 12 to 15 pieces on the major news organizations. But that's TV, so if you look at that first and then compare it to online, there were some interesting differences there. So for example, Al Jazeera English used quite a lot of user-generated content on television, but hardly any on the web. Conversely, CNN International kind of used about 17 pieces per day, but then online, 90 pieces per day, partly because they have iReport, which is kind of their UGC project. But there were real differences between television and online, which was actually really interesting.
And then we looked at the stories. So in the 3-week period we had a very big, unfortunate helicopter crash in Scotland, in Glasgow, when a helicopter fell into the roof of a pub. And as you can see on the blue line there, the big blue line, we have the peak of a single story for Glasgow. Throughout, we had Syria. So you can see on the green line there, every day there was something from Syria. And then we also can deduce from that that obviously UGC was mainly used when there was nothing else, or when it was breaking news. So the peak in Glasgow goes down very quickly as soon as news organizations get their crews in place. So the peak was overnight from the Friday. The crash happened at 10 p.m. in the evening. Overnight, there was nothing else. There was no crews in Glasgow. It's not a media hub. By the time that crews have managed to get in place on the Saturday morning, so the next day, there's a big drop-off. You see nothing of the spike. So, and then the Syria throughout, again, nobody can get into Syria, or it's very hard to get into Syria. It's very hard to get content out of Syria. So the Syria was permanent. And then we see during the period, we covered the death of Nelson Mandela, and the daily use just drops off completely. That's because news organizations have spent a lot of time, a lot of money, invested a lot of resources in South Africa, so they didn't feel the need to actually use UGC. So it was very much a usage for breaking news when there was nothing else. However, in our interviews, there were a couple of news organizations which had a lot of success, really actually investing in UGC and using it as a research tool to bring other stories to light. So Channel 4 News in the UK has spent a lot of time investing in people to actually study UGC, and they've actually had a lot of success, for instance, keeping the stories of Syrian barrel bombs alive when the media riot had gone away, and actually carried on that story and differentiating themselves from their competitors by investing in UGC. But that was very, very rare. And then we see the similar thing online as well. So over the 5 days, Syria was permanent. We had a bit of a bulge for the Glasgow in green there, but it was Syria. It was where there was nothing else. It was protests in Thailand. It was protests in Ukraine and protests in Egypt.
So today we really want to focus on the qualitative part of the research, and that was because we interviewed 64 different people. Most of those were kind of half-an-hour interviews. They were really rich, and we wanted to make sure that we just didn't focus on these rolling news channels. So we specifically talked to a lot of smaller national news organizations from Finland and Sweden, and all sorts of places that often we don't hear from. So there was a whole host of different news organizations we talked to. All of them were fascinating. And we also talked to the agencies. Before we went into this research, we didn't necessarily think the agencies would play such a huge role. They play an incredibly important role in terms of how user-generated content is used by news organizations. There's a huge reliance. So we talked to all of the agencies and found actually very different practices, which is a crucial point. But there were real differences between those large rolling news organizations and those national news organizations that have a kind of half-an-hour evening bulletin.
So moving on, we then into our first major area is workflow. And we saw very much there were two different types of news organizations dealing with UGC. We had the large, mostly European organization, the public broadcasters, the BBC in the UK, ARD in Germany, ZDF in Germany as well, who actually invested a lot of time and resources in UGC. The BBC has established something called the UGC Hub, which is staffed by 20 people, 5 people on at any one time. And then there were the smaller news organizations. Some had actually realized the importance of UGC, mainly because of Syria or the Arab Spring, and they had one person working 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, on UGC, normally an Arabic speaker. Or there was those that had nobody. And they relied very much on the agencies, on Associated Press Television News, on Reuters, on Storyful, or on my old employer, the European Broadcasting Union, to provide them with UGC. And such to the extent that in their workflow, some of the organizations actually said, oh, sorry, we don't use UGC. But they did because it came from the agencies. So there's still that disconnect between, it's an agency feed, so we just use anything, we put it out, you know, blah, 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 great, thank you very much. It's like rain, gold coming from the sky. And very much a disconnect between that and actually using UGC. To the extent that, you know, one senior foreign editor told us that for him, it was actually, you know, that's what he was paying for from the agencies. It's the best way for him of getting UGC. Somebody else has done the work. Somebody else has gone through all the processes about which we'll talk throughout this presentation. And that's also something that the agencies heard back from their clients. That was echoed back to us when we went into the agencies. One of their senior editors saying, well, that's what they want us for. The agencies see themselves as being the insurance policy for the news organizations. To the extent that we heard from them that some people would even, some of their clients, their news organizations, would call them with a YouTube link saying, can you verify that for us? Because we don't want to take the risk ourselves. So they're actually asking their agency to verify and confirm for them.
So it's no surprise if we're talking about user-generated content that one of the first issues would be verification. And it's important to note that across the board, people are terrified of running with content that's wrong. There's a real awareness that, oh, if we use anything sourced from social media, how can we trust it? So that came through really strongly. But then when we talked to them about, well, what are your systematic processes for verification, there was a high level of ignorance and lots of talk of like, well, it's just gut instinct. Oh, I've been doing this for 30 years, you just know. But then when you say, well, what about the kind of online forensic checks you can do with social media content? There was not much sense of what they were, particularly from the editors who were making the decisions about whether or not to run with it. So when we'd say, what's the threshold by which you decide whether to run with content, it was very much the gut instinct. And some of the kind of people working on the social media desks, they knew things like reverse image search, they knew some things like, oh, who is, but there wasn't a kind of a systematic checklist approach to verifying content. And that was really surprising to us, that there was a real fear about getting it wrong, but not very much knowledge about the specific checks that they could be running. So this is a quote actually from a kind of an editor who knew quite a lot about verification. She said, verification is always an afterthought. It's sort of like, let's just get it on air and online and then not worry about it. When someone puts something forward in an editorial meeting, I'll say, have you verified it? And people groan. People are scared of the V word. They know it's going to take a long time. So there was a lot of discussion about the tensions that occurred during a breaking news event when those people who are trying to do the verification are being screamed at by the output editors that say, look, our competitors are running with it, just throw it up. Whilst they would still reflect and say, well, we can't get it wrong, but then clearly during breaking news events, if the competitors were running it, well, we'll just run it too. And you saw that with Andy Carvin talking about how one thing that goes unchecked just kind of spirals out of control. So the issue about verification was really interesting. Very little actual verification training going on, and actually very few kind of systematic processes in place.
One thing that most organizations were aware of, though, was that they had to ask permission to use it. They knew, it's a rights issue. One person said to us, we're a rights organization, we have to respect the rights of other people. So they were good at saying, yes, we needed to ask to use this stuff. The way, however, permission was asked varied quite differently. And what we see here is a very keen, successful Reuters producer basically concluding an international worldwide rights distribution deal in 140 characters. This was on the night of the Glasgow helicopter crash, the peak story for us during the period, where we have the Reuters producer saying, hi, can I use your stuff in a worldwide deal with credit? And the owner of the content, Christina O'Neill, at the bottom just saying, yes. That's it, done. In fairness to Reuters, in our interview with the senior management, they said, oh, we actually insist on an email and we take it a lot further than that. But as we see here, that was actually done. Now, other organizations, such as Storyful, for instance, now have in place a serious online agreement platform that's gone through the lawyers. But increasingly, we're seeing a different way of agreeing permissions with people. And that actually proceeds into those who work in rights. So they're very aware of the problems that could come at. A rights person said that she'd walk into a newsroom and say, have you got the rights, have you got the rights? And the journalist would say, stop, we're working at the coalface of truth, get out of my way, you're stifling my creativity. They all think it's just, as we say in English, management bollocks. And there's a real concern from those people down the line, from the rights people, from the lawyers, that actually this could end up in a legal case, which actually stifles the use of UGC in the future. That if they don't take permissions seriously, if they don't take the legal aspect of this seriously, so far we were told, oh, what happens when you make a mistake, when you use something without the right permission? Oh, we give them £1,000, €1,000, $1,000, and they go away quietly. Now, nobody so far has actually tested that further. It's not actually ended up in court, but there's very much a fear in the rights people, in the lawyers, that could actually happen.
So crediting became a really huge part of this research. And I have to use this screen grab because I love it so much. This was from last month in Australia, where somebody who's apparently famous in Australia was involved in a punch-up on the street. And News Corp bought the photos for quite a large amount of money, but then realized that in an era where you can just kind of right-click, copy-paste, people might not understand that they had paid a lot of money for these photos. So they put their own credit on in a way that I would sort of secretly love it if all uploaders did this. And I sort of feel like if we don't do this, we need something this serious for things to change. So actually the number that actually got quoted a lot last month when we published our first phase was that only 16% of the UGC that we coded during our study had an on-screen credit. So here's an example from Euronews where they did actually add a credit, but this was very, very rare. And 16% is the average. Some news organizations were much better, some were much worse, and organizations that you probably wouldn't think should be much worse. So for us, it was really shocking. Even though I've worked in this space for a long time, even I was horribly shocked at the 16%. But then when we talked to news managers, it was quite clear that there isn't a culture of worrying about this in newsrooms. So this was a very senior news manager who said, we don't credit Reuters, we don't credit AP's pictures, so why would we credit user-generated content when there is no requirement for us to do so? Oh, apart from the legal requirement, love. So there is a real issue here about people just not thinking it was a problem and equating AP or Reuters pictures, which they're paying for, versus something that my mum has uploaded when she was on holiday and saw a flood. And there's a fundamental difference here, but the management didn't necessarily see it that way.
And if we go back to the rights people, however, they still continue to see it that way. And here's what one rights person lawyer said to us: attribution is such a big element to it. Actually, people aren't really after the money. Most people just want to see their name up in lights. So why aren't the news organizations able to do that? People just want the hat tip to say thank you. It's thank you for using my content. I'd like my name shown. Yet so few news organizations are prepared to do it, or don't have that system embedded in their processes, their newsroom processes.
And we differentiated between crediting versus labeling. So crediting is to say this photo was taken by Sam Dubberley. Labeling is simply explaining that this content is user-generated content, that it wasn't filmed by anybody related to the newsroom. And this is an issue around transparency. So this is Greenpeace, for example. Lots of journalists would understand, okay, if we're using content filmed by Greenpeace, we should probably label the fact that it's from Greenpeace because they have an agenda. But when we talk about user-generated content, we've got accidental journalists, people who happen to just be there with a smartphone who capture something. We have people like UNHCR aid workers on the Syrian border capturing video of refugees crossing the border, and news organizations using that. We've got Syrian activists uploading to YouTube with a very clear agenda of what they're doing, and we lump all of that together as user-generated content, but we're not necessarily being transparent with the audience about who's uploading this, why are they uploading it, and why we're using it. And that for us was a really critical aspect. And so again, when we counted how many times UGC was labeled, 72% of UGC during our study was not given any description at all. It was just used as if it was vision that had been created by the newsroom. This is an exception. This is Al Jazeera English, which had made a policy decision a few months ago that every time they use content from Syria, they label it as youtube.com/activist video. But that's specifically around the Syrian context. There aren't policies around how do we do this generally. And there isn't a really good answer. Some news organizations are happy to mention the platform. Some news organizations absolutely don't not want to mention the platform. So we haven't got an industry standard here, and we don't actually have the answers ourselves yet.
And then we move on from labeling to the general ethics surrounding the use of UGC. And for us, we split that into 3 different areas of ethics which we looked at that came out from our interviews and from our coding. First of all, it was to the colleagues, to people who actually work with this on a day-to-day basis. Second, it was to the audience, the people who are actually looking at this online or on their TV screens in their evening bulletin. And the final one, or the first one in this case that we looked at, was actually to the uploader. And that's a person who is actually there, probably at an accident that they didn't want to be at, or an event that they really just happened to be there with their iPhone. In the UK in January, we had really big storms and flooding. And as you can see there, this is a tweet by the Coast Guard, the UK Coast Guard, to Sky News. And in fairness, they sent the same to BBC News and to ITV News, the 3 big channels in the UK, asking these organizations to stop asking people to send in UGC to them because it was dangerous. And people we interviewed were aware of that. They really were aware of that. However, they all kind of, nudge and a wink, kind of said, well, we'd still use it if it was sent to us. And there was a feeling that, of course, they wouldn't go out then asking for more. Could you go back and like shoot it from a different angle, of course. But there was still this very much idea that, people would still ask the public, their viewers, to send in pictures even when an event was dangerous. Now, there are changes. There are kind of advisories in the small print at the bottom of web pages and so on and so forth. But it's not really become institutionalized again. 1 or 2 organizations have started to change their language. So one organization, Guardian Witness we spoke to, has changed the language from stop sending, could you please send in content, to could you please share your content with us? So the idea that, you've got it, so could you please share it with us, rather than could you go out and get it and send it in to us? And they actually had reported an improvement in the content they received. And they said they were able to build a community of people, and that was actually bearing some benefits. That language shift has really borne some benefits for them.
Newsrooms are also really aware about their responsibilities to the general audience, and there were a number of conversations about how now, because of social media and the fact that the audience can access the same pictures at the same time as they could on the news website, they were having real conversations about that their boundaries were shifting, and they're actually showing more graphic content now than they used to because there was an awareness of, well, the audience are seeing it on Facebook or YouTube anyway. And actually Channel 4 News, again in the UK, talked to us about the way that they covered the chemical weapons attack in Syria at the end of August, and they felt that they had a real responsibility to share some of those YouTube videos, but they were so graphic, they put in place a sense of, here's a page that says, are you sure you want to see them? Click. Now, are you really sure you want to see them? Are you really, really sure? And at that point, you could actually see them. So there's interesting conversations now internally about how those boundaries are shifting when you can pretty much see anything on YouTube.
And then one of the final areas of ethics we talked about was responsibility toward the staff of the newsroom, the people who are looking at it every day. And this is a quote from some research that we got access to that's not yet published by Dr. Feinstein and colleagues. It will be published later this year, where they say the frequency of exposure to user-generated content independently and consistently predicted multiple indices of psychopathology and increased alcohol consumption. So there was very much a feeling in many of our interviews that, you know, we spoke to news managers who had been in Bosnia 20 years ago, and it was like, well, it's like Bosnia, isn't it? It's like, oh, when Johnny and I were down the line, we'd go down the pub and we'd talk about it. And there was very much a feeling like, well, you just have to get over it. That's not the case. And those news organizations that had invested time in realizing that this was something different, it was something new. There's a flood of UGC now that you're looking at it in your newsroom day after day after day, and had actually implemented policies around that, had seen a big improvement in their team, in the health of their staff. And little things like that mean, for instance, setting up a rotational policy where somebody isn't looking at UGC for 8 hours a day, they're looking at it for two hours a day. Or if it's a weekly rotation, you only work on the UGC desk 2 days out of 5. Another thing that had borne some impact that had improved things for teams was many journalists, again, those ones who are in Bosnia or the ones who'd been frequently in the field, you'd offer them counseling, they'd be offered individual counseling by the news organizations, and they were hard-nosed. They'd say, I don't need it. But those who'd actually introduced some group counseling first had actually seen impact of forcing those people, forcing the whole team to actually sit down and talk about it, and then making it clear how, if somebody wanted to, obviously you can't force people to carry on with this, but how if somebody wanted to or felt they needed to, how they could follow up on that, had some real impact.
So finally, no report is worth its salt unless it has some recommendations. We have 14. We're not going to go through all 14 because we hope you read the report, but just to highlight some that we think are particularly important. So of course for us, crediting was a huge problem, and there were different reasons people gave for not doing it. One of the main reasons people gave for not crediting or labeling was screen clutter. Those of you that live in the US and watch American channels might be surprised by that. But yes, there were other broadcasters that were worried about the aesthetics of their screen. So that's one of the reasons. There are other reasons that are technological, that a lot of the newsroom technology was not built for user-generated content. So really we were saying you've got to have crediting guidelines from the very top. Newsrooms know that they can't just steal sports content. They understand rights about sports. It needs to be the same culture for user-generated content.
And then we looked at newsroom technology, the one at the top there. We felt very much that one of the big problems, especially around crediting, was that newsroom technology was a bit behind the times. So even those organizations with very advanced, as we call, media asset management systems, they put a piece of UGC into the media asset management system, and the metadata wouldn't travel with the UGC. So even those with the best will of the world who wanted to credit things, if the right processes every time were not followed down the chain, the workflow chain of a newsroom, the details about the credit would go amiss. So one of our things was that we should find a way to enable credits to be burnt into the UGC video as it enters the system. In that way that the crediting wouldn't go amiss. It wouldn't be possible to forget it or not put it up in the gallery because it was breaking news and we didn't have time and so on.
So as we've been stating, the agencies play a huge role in this, and each agency has very different standards, to a point that if you are a news organization, you need to ask some big questions of your agencies. And so, for example, this isn't pointing fingers at Reuters because they said this publicly, but Reuters doesn't actually tell you who uploaded content. They say because they haven't spoken to that person in a room, they can't necessarily trust them, so they just simply say source social media website, which means that a news organization can't actually credit even if they wanted to because they don't have that information. So one of our biggest recommendations is that agencies are very clear about who uploaded the content, and they're very clear about the verification processes that they went through, because some of the news organizations we spoke to, they double verify content that comes in from the agencies. So it's very important to be very clear about the steps that have been taken.
And then we had some recommendations to the social networks themselves, one of which, of the many, was that we would advise the social networks, we think that the social networks should move towards a common standard for news, a 24-hour news license. Very much like the Creative Commons that happens a lot for photographs and so on, and academic reports. An actual standard of permission for use for 24 hours for news organizations, which helps both the uploader, so they know what they're doing with it, but also creates an understanding in newsrooms a lot more easier that what does Facebook do and what can we do with YouTube again, and what about if it's a TwitPic or if it's a Hootsuite, rather than so actually have a common standard across the industry, across the social media networks, so that newsrooms know what they can do with content and what they can't do with content.
And because we believe in crediting, we'd like to point out that Mark Little came up with that idea, and he's in the room. If he wasn't, we would have pretended it was our idea. And lastly, my background is training, and it was quite shocking to me and Sam when we did these interviews that there is very, very little training in newsrooms specifically around user-generated content, whether that's around verification, whether that's around how to gain permissions, whether that's around health and safety. But as we know, newsrooms have limited resources, and training often is the thing that gets left off at the end. So I think there's a really big role for journalism schools to be teaching their own journalism students these practices, but also to develop syllabi and teaching materials that can be shared with newsrooms so that we're all working across the same standards here. And I think this is a really exciting role for journalism schools to play. So that's our report. It's long, it's multifaceted. Luckily, you've got the weekend to read it. But we'd love to hear any feedback or any questions that you have. So thank you very much for your time. There's no microphone.
Anybody has any? Just unused silence.
So for those of us who are not in a position to go to journalism school and are not working for major corporations or legacy news outlets that have that funding or have those trainings in place, where are places and sources that we can go to learn, for example, advanced verification techniques?
That is a great question. So one thing I'd say is that there's a free handbook called the Verification Handbook, which was edited by Craig Silverman, which is verificationhandbook.com, which has a number of different chapters written around the specifics of how do you verify a video, how do you verify a tweet. Also, there's some online training courses that are around that I may have produced. So there are, you're seeing increasing resources around this, and Storyful has done a great job. If you go to the Storyful blog, there are incredible pieces about examples of pieces of content that they verified, and they go through the different steps. Because all the verification tools that any organization uses, like Storyful, they're all free tools. So it's reverse image search, it's Whois, it's EXIF data, but it's just a case of learning which tools to use at what time and how do you piece that puzzle together. But if you're a freelancer, it's one of the best things you can do because there's a real absence of those skills in Newsroom. So yeah, it would be a great thing to do.
Thanks so much. Well, thank you, guys. That was fabulous.
Thanks, Taylor.
Please.